I'm Daniel Ziblatt, and really happy today to have the opportunity to hear from Wolfgang Merkel on the pitfalls of militant democracy. Let me just say a couple of words of introduction to Wolfgang and to the topic. Professor Merkel has served as the director of the Democracy and Democratization Research Group at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin for many years. Before that, was a professor at Heidelberg and other places, but a very important voice in debates about democracy in Germany. His most recent book, Entzweilicht, Zerbrechlichkeit und Resilienz der Demokratie, and so has really been, as I said, an important voice on thinking about democracy and challenges to democracy, not only in Germany but comparatively. But just in recent years, his voice has always been an important one that I go to think about the challenges that German democracy faces, democracies around the world face. And as some of you may know, that's one of the themes of the center this year and next year is democracy and its critics. And this topic of militant democracy has always been a theme in German democracy, post-war German democracy. It's also comparatively become, I think, increasingly interesting in the United States. Just this past year, we've had the U.S. Supreme Court deciding whether or not the 14th Amendment could be used to prohibit Donald Trump for running for or holding office, and the court decided to not do that. But that was sort of our own, the U.S. has its own underappreciated form of militant democracy that's underutilized or not utilized at all. But there are, of course, big problems and lots of debate about militant democracy and whether it or not it is consistent with democracy at all. So this is we're going to presumably hear from Wolfgang about. But just two other very quick comments about context about why this topic is so interesting with regards to Germany today. Both the recent essential collapse of the government and the call for new elections and the kind of dynamics of German politics today. One of the things that's certainly at play is the fragmentation of the party landscape, which is due to the rise in part of parties that might be regarded as threats to democracy or threats to the Constitution. And then also just the recent elections in the East German states, where the AfD has done incredibly well and also made it very difficult for the formation of government. So all of this question of how to deal with forces that are not democratic or committed to the Constitution is a dilemma that Germany faces, the US faces, and I couldn't think of a better person to hear some thoughts on this from Wolfgang. One other thing I would need to note about Wolfgang is that he's a longtime friend of the WZB, of the Center for European Studies and of the WZB. But he was a recipient back in 1988 of the John F. Kennedy Memorial Fellowship. So was at the Center for European Studies before we were in this building. In 2016, he was also here, and so we're really happy to have him here for these couple of weeks around. He came right at the right time to witness what's happening in the U.S. So very happy to welcome you back. So thank you, Wolfgang.
So, hello to everybody. I have to confess, standing here, I'm a bit nervous, but normally, or at least experience tells me this will vanish after the first sentences. I'm glad to be here, and this is more or less the beginning of some serious work on the problem of militant democracy. Even the term is not completely unproblematic, as we might discuss later on. The slogan, "No tolerance for the enemies of tolerance," has been part of the discourse on militant democracy since the late 1940s. And they had a first peak in the 1970s, when there was a wave of repression against leftists. And the leftists have been considered as being partly, at least, unconstitutionally, and they have to be kept away from public employment. What is interesting that we are witnessing now a new renaissance of militant democracy, this time not driven by conservatives, not against the left, but this time driven especially by the green leftist camp, not only, but especially this part of the progressives of the German landscape. And it is now against the right. And the interesting thing is, and so it was timely that you invited me, even we did not know it, yesterday there was a first step of a group of 113 parliamentarians to start the procedure to ban the AfD, to ban the right-wing populists. Interesting is not the number. There's only a minor requirement at the beginning. It's 5% of all parliamentarians, but then they need, after a debate, they need the majority of the parliamentarians of the Bundestag. The interesting thing is the composition of this group. And the composition is 55 of those parliamentarians are coming from the Greens. 30-something, 33, I think, from the SPD, and only 7 from the Christian Democratic Union. I think I will come back to this question. Why is it now the left who thinks that what I would call illiberal measures and highly problematic measures from a democratic point of view, why is now the left engaging that much in banning? And I have to be honest, in banning a highly problematic right-wing, I hesitate to say fascist, because it's mostly a wrong term, highly problematic right-wing radical party. And here you have my cognitive map, which leads me through my presentation. Basically are 6 steps. I will briefly give you some figures on the frame of the renaissance of militant democracy. And then in 2 steps, I will look to constitutional theory, to 2 polar positions which have a complete different view on what democracy means and which means a democracy can employ in order to defend itself. So the one is Hans Kelsen and the other one is Karl Löwenstein, an Austrian and a German one. The 2 are emigres and which emigrated to the United States. And as it is the case, they could not enter law school as bloody German lawyers, so they had to become political scientists. Löwenstein in Amherst and finally Hans Kelsen in Berkeley. Then I will, and this is the core of my presentation, engage in some normative arguments. Is it plausible? Is it reasonable to ban such a party? And do we have good normative arguments to do it? Or are there some arguments which can speak against it? And if you have a constellation where you have on the one side somebody who is highly critical and another person who is highly in favor of banning such a party, one has the comfortable position to ask, is there a third way between Löwenstein and Hans Kelsen? If we look to the electoral success of right-wing populist parties in Europe, not completely, and of course not all the European country, you get the following picture. I do it from above to below, and you see Italy, where you have an electoral dominant political force at the moment, and these are the Fratelli d'Italia and La Lega. You have 2 right-wing populist party. I don't want to now argue who is more to the right. According to my point of view, it is La Lega, which is openly racist. And then you have the last elections in France. Rassemblement National received 31% of the votes, and I think 2 months ago or 3 months ago, we had elections in Austria, and the right-wing populist FPÖ became the strongest party. If you go down to the red line, and the red line is Germany, visibly below the success of these right-wing populist parties in major European countries. But what is very interesting, if you look to single states, and here you have Saxony, Thuringia, and Brandenburg, here the AfD received votes more or less to the same degree and amount as in Italy and France. So the normality is obviously with regard to right-wing populism, not Germany as a whole, but certainly East German Länder, and especially these 3 Länder I have quoted. If you ask how many countries have seen right-wing populists in government, you get the following pictures. In 13 EU member states, you had right-wing populist parties as official coalition partners in governing coalitions. And if you ask in how many governments, because in some countries you had it repeatedly, in Austria, for example, and in some Scandinavian countries, certainly the best liberal democracies we have on the globe, where you had right-wing populist party, 27 government. If you look to Germany, nothing, nada, niente. You didn't have one government where the AfD made it to the government. It has very much to do that the German political elites of the democratic established party engaged in a kind of conventio ad excludendum. This is the term Giovanni Sartori has used in his famous book in 1976. A firewall had to be built between the Democratic Party and the problematic right-wing or right-wing extremist party in Germany. And this is not only true for the federal level. In none of the Länder the AfD made it into the government. Just to put it in a frame, because there is a certain contradiction that, according to my knowledge, in none of these European member states you had such an intensive discussion banning this party. So I have already talked about major features of the renaissance of militant democracy in Germany. As we know, one reason why right-wing populist party became so prominent and successful is the established and political parties. And one of the most important type of political parties, catch-all parties, are in decline, and the voters are looking for new agents of representation, for new parties of representation, and there is a new political space on the right wing where right-wing populist parties such as the AfD can march in, if I can use this term. There's a decline of catch-all parties and paralleled by an increasing, continuing volatility of voters. And in Germany, at least in some of the East German Länder, the AfD became a status which Giovanni Sartori would describe as a relevant party. Relevant because they have a blackmail potential to prevent the formation of a governing coalition. At the same time, there was a shift, and Sherry Berman was talking about these days here in the center of the shift of the democratic left. And one element of this shift was that in the after the year 2000, many of these center-left parties moved from classical redistributional social democratic policies towards cultural policies, left identitarian policies. And that means on the other side, the rest of the working class voters, which still voted for the Social Democratic Party, lost the last cultural ties and to the Social Democratic parties. And if you ask who are the representing the working class in Germany, it is in the Western countries, the Christian Democratic Union. And if you look to East Germany, it is the AfD. So the Social Democratic Party have nothing to do anymore, I would say, beyond a small, small core of well-established workers in car factories such as Mercedes, BMW, and so forth. One very German point, as I can see, it is an actor which is not really legally established as a political actor in the German political competition, and this is the domestic intelligence. The literal translation is of this institution, the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution. So this is somehow unique in Germany if I compare it to other European countries. And what I think is highly problematic, that part of the executive, because it is controlled by, especially by the Minister of Interior, become a political player in characterizing, defining a specific party during the last years, especially the AfD, as sometimes suspicious to be unconstitutional or secure to be unconstitutional. And doing this, it certainly influences the competition of political parties in Germany. So I would call it, to some extent, if we compare it against the background of the medium electoral success of the AfD, there is a certain moralistic alarmism in Germany, and it comes out of our barbarian history. We want to make things better and to give a good example, not only to ourselves, but to the rest of the European countries. Constitutional theory, what do they tell us? And if you read Karl Löwenstein, who is, by the way, the inventor of the term militant democracy, he used it as the first, as far as I can see. He wrote 2 articles in the American Political Science Review, 1937, 2 in a row. And what is quite interesting, if you read it, I think it's not one of the best constitutional articles or writings. If you look at it, he was successful not to quoting a single source, which is, if you read constitutional literature or legal literature, which is quite extraordinary. But the term became quite well known, and one of his core arguments has been fascism can only be defeated with its own means. Meaning democracy has to give up certain democratic principles because there is the higher aim to defend democracy against totalitarian, at that time, totalitarian parties. And he was looking especially to the regimes of the Stalinist Soviet Union and the fascist Germany. Because unconstitutional extremist parties are using democratic institutions as a kind of Trojan horse for their purposes, the democracies are legitimated even to act against their own principles. Anti-system parties, he wrote, has to be simply taken out of the political game. No tolerance against the intolerance. If you look at the writing of Karl Raimund Popper in the late 1940s, you find this term again, and he's writing in a similar way Löwenstein did before. If one goes one step back and look at that debate, it seemed to me it reflects a Schumpeterian argument that it is about the elites who govern, and the elites democracy need. And that means too much participation is not good for democracy. So it's to some extent the idea which becomes stronger and stronger, at least when if I look at the development in Europe, it is the idea to protect democracy from the people. And watching the electoral debates here in the United States and looking at the success of Donald Trump, one has certain emotional sympathy for such an approach. Okay, I'll leave it with that. It is too risky to continue. So the second one is Hans Kelsen, probably the most influential constitutionalist, at least in Europe, of the 20th century. And he says a democracy which asserts itself against the will of the majority of the people has ceased to be a democracy. And democracy is not allowed to suspend their own principle, even if it runs the risk to collapse. It is in itself a rather consistent argument, but it leaves democracy to a large extent defenseless. And he said explicitly, and he writes explicitly, that anti-democratic beliefs have exactly the same right to be heard in a democracy as any other one. So he even argues that the existence of anti-democratic beliefs is a sign that democracy is working. And the only red line for him is violence. So it is legitimate to have anti-democratic beliefs. It is legitimate for political parties to campaign on these anti-democratic beliefs. It is only violence which democracy can go against it. If democracy tries to defend itself against these beliefs, anti-democratic beliefs, by repression, then Democrats erode democracy by trying to defend democracy. Maybe I should mention this is pure constitutional thinking, and Hans Kelsen does not look at the framing, the context, the social embedding of these principles within society. So another famous constitutionalist, Hermann Heller, of this Weimar period, is very much insisting it is a kind of social justice, and the democracy has to develop, otherwise it will not survive. So you have another position here in the constitutional debate. If I come to the question, does it make sense? Will it be successful to ban a political party such as the AfD? I am rather skeptical. First, it endures, and it takes quite a long time, such a procedure, and it has already taken against the openly neo-Nazi party NPD, Nationaldemokratische Partei Deutschland. It took the Constitutional Court 3 years, and then he came to the decision, no, we cannot ban it. And at that time, the argument was too many agents provocateurs from the domestic intelligence entered in the party, even into the highest top elites, and this is a reason why it cannot be banned. So, long endurance, 3 years, and during this time, the AfD can play the classical right-wing populist game, blaming the system, blaming the establishment of trying to exclude them from the political game, presenting themselves as the victims of the system. And if you think about, after all this time, let's say after 2 or 3 years, the Constitutional Court refrains from banning, this would be an ultimate push of legitimacy for the AfD. So from a pragmatic point of view, this is highly risky to engage in such a procedure. And if the Constitutional Court finally bans the AfD, then the question how to implement it comes up, and it would entail quite a high degree of repression. Think about a party of 20% spread all over the country, has to be from one day to the other taken out of all the parliamentarians have to leave the parliament. They were elected freely. Again, not a sympathetic party, and a racist party quite often as well. Nevertheless, there will be high repression costs for the German government, and it might illiberalize the political climate of the whole country. And then there is another point. I'm still continuing with pragmatic arguments against the banning, and the other argument is they will resurface under a different label. They will rename the political party as it has been done in the 1950s. In 1956, the Stalinist Communist Party of Germany were banned, KPD, and resurfaced a few years later or a few months later under a new label called Deutsche Kommunistische Partei, German Communist Party. And more or less the same people, more or less the same program, and then it was too small to be banned by the Constitutional Court. At that time, the Constitutional Court was closer to the executive as it is now, the case now. It is certainly the most estimated institution among the population in Germany. So I'm skeptical if I look at the pragmatic argument, and I'm even more skeptical about the normative arguments. And I consider myself to reflect upon this question from a radical democratic point of view. So it's not something simply democratic. I think this is core of democracy, and it would be problematic to ban political parties. The first question is we learn and discuss with our students who, by the way, is the sovereign of the political rule. It is certainly the people. What happens if 20% of the people were deprived of their representatives? So then an institution with a very thin formal democratic legitimation, such as a constitutional court, would ban the representatives of 20% of the demos, the sovereign. I think this is a constitutional problem which still has to be solved. It would also mean that pluralism, and we are proud that democracy has a pluralist range of different political parties. The demos can select its representative if the pluralism is restricted, so that the institution of the Constitutional Court and part of the political party are defining what is legitimate pluralism. So it's not the people, it is the political establishment. In this case, if you read Chantal Mouffe, she certainly would despise this. What is quite interesting, who, by the way, are the applicants? Who are the ones who are constitutional legitimized to enter in to start such a procedure? There are three institutions. The one is government, the second one is the Bundestag, one chamber of the parliament, and the third one is the Bundesrat. Who is sitting in these institutions? Nobody else than political parties. So a competitor initiates a procedure which takes other competitors out of the political game. In sports, we would certainly say this is an impossible thing to do. So I still think if we agree that political parties are rational political actors, then one cannot think that these rational calculus is completely absent from the other political parties. This has somehow the gusto of an unfair competition. Democracy has a huge advantage compared to autocratic systems, that it has a feedback loop by voting and voting political parties out of government. And this is probably the most decisive process of political learning. They learn what they have done wrongly. They learn why people do not think they want to be represented by them anymore. And if you ban simply political parties, the democratic political parties such as AfD, the democratic political parties would deprive themselves from political learning. What have we done wrongly? And if there is such a boom of right-wing populist parties in almost all European countries, one has to ask, does it have to do nothing with the functioning of the democratic political parties? Obviously, as Adam Jaworski is writing, obviously this might not be a crisis of democracy in the dramatic sense, but it's certainly a crisis of democratic representation. We are in it. So self-depriving of political learning, and I have already talked about the somehow dubious role of the domestic intelligence, the office, the Federal Office of the Protection of the Constitution. I come to the conclusion. The question is, if we cannot accept this kind of argument that principles of democracies can be suspended, and in a kind of Carl Schmittian sense, the sovereignty of the state is above the sovereignty of the people on the one side, and Hans Kelsen's somehow defenseless democracy, which is, again, in itself completely consistent, democratically argued, at least I think this, then we have to look for what one can call a third way. I already talked about it. The situation in Germany is certainly not as problematic as in Italy, as in France, as in the Netherlands, and so forth. The right-wing populists are not as strong enough. And the first empirical studies I have seen is, and I didn't like that much, this findings is that right-wing populist parties were not able in government, at least in Western Europe, to change the constitution, to change fundamental policies. So this is only a small margin which they could change. It is completely different if we look to weaker democracies as we find them in younger democracies as we find them in Eastern Europe. What we did not discuss and do not discuss that much is that in times of subjectively experienced crises of democracy, the people look more to the output than to the participatory input. And Milan Zvolik and his team, they found out that people are prepared to give up in such situation democratic principles for the right political result, for the right political policies, for the policies they want. And this is not only if it comes to the right-wing populist voters who are perfectly prepared to give up democratic principles if immigration can be stopped. You find it among Greens, especially if there are successes against this dramatic crisis of global warming. Then they said, we have to suspend all these veto players you find in a democracy. So in such situation, there is a preparedness to give up democratic principles for the output or outcome of policy making. So we have to look, and governments have to look also to the output, which is the result of the political decisions. And I come back to the argument of Hermann Heller, and you find it certainly in the writing of John Rawls as well, that social inclusion, social justice, fairness is something which is important, that the people develop a sense of belongingness to the democratic system. If there is an increasing inequality, such a sense of belonging to a political community can not really evolve. And we have, and this was the photo before, we had in Germany quite massive demonstrations of the democratic part of the civil society when it came up, what parts of the radical right were planning, meaning in American terms, deportation. In Germany, one is somehow more cautious. They call it remigration. So this is exactly the same thing they are talking about. And they were massive, and there was a strong civil society, so to say, as guardian of the democratic constitution. And I also believe that representative democracies have too much closed themselves against more popular forms of political participation, as we can see in citizen assemblies and referenda, and the discussion here some years ago, of course, about a deliberation day, for example, in the United States, are examples of it. What the Constitutional Court did already when it came to the NPD, again, this neo-Nazi party, they cut the public financing for these parties. So more or less, if a party gets more than 0.5% of the votes, the party will get money for their own financing. And here I'm softer, I'm against the banning of political parties, but I do think democracy does not have to finance them. Even Hans Kelsen probably would not accept such an argument. So the question is, and I'm not completely against it, the banning of a political party can still be the ultima ratio, can be, so to say, the last instance. And it can be a Damocles sword, which limits these extremist success. However, in the moment where you apply it, it certainly has a risk that you liberalize democracy, and this is probably the disease of democratic regimes in this time. So we are living in times where we have the danger and the risk of illiberalization from two sides, not only from these nasty, normatively spoken, nasty and problematic right-wing populist party, but at the same time by the defenders of democracy against these populist parties. And we forget it, and so to say, my own political camp, the ecological left completely forgets about it because it goes against the right enemy, and they forget about principles and procedures. I think I leave it with that, and I'm curious how you demolish my strong statement I have done here.
If you want to take a seat, we can have a conversation. Yes, wonderful. Thank you very much, Wolfgang, and look forward to comments. And I see hands up already. So we have until 1:15. So I'll be sure to call on people, but maybe I want to take my role to kind of provoke discussion further. But it looks like there may be some people who already have comments. But let me just ask two very quick questions, and then before answering that, I'll open it up so we can begin to get more input. So. Yeah, very, very interesting, and I'm broadly sympathetic to your perspective, but to play devil's advocate, I think on the normative critique, which I find to be particularly persuasive. This point that we're restricting pluralism and restricting choice. Of course, democracies already do that all the time. Through electoral systems, a two-party system already eliminates. And so, in your view, is there a normative difference between the banning of parties through, let's say, the Constitution, this office of the Constitution, versus the effective banning of parties through electoral systems and electoral system design that only gives you two parties, for instance? Clearly these are very different, but is it from a kind of democratic theory perspective, what is the difference? That's one point. I have lots of questions, but I'll resist the temptation to go through the long list. A second question I have is on the vigilance of civil society. I think one way of thinking about that is that rather than having the state ban parties to kind of to put it in like provocative terms, to use the power of what people now call cancel culture. So essentially horizontal members of society say that these views are outrageous, unacceptable, and to engage in this process. So we. Is that a liberal? Is that itself a kind of liberal solution, or does that contain some illiberal elements? You certainly think of. I'm thinking here of Mill's description of how the pressures of conformity are a threat to liberty, or Tocqueville also writes about in the Democracy of America has this paragraph which sounds just straight out of the 2010s, saying that in a democracy, people kind of resist saying what they really think because they fear they'll lose their positions, and and they are embarrassed when they make these positions. So in a sense, these kind of horizontal pressures of civil society, is that? I like that as a solution, but is there any? How does one decide when these kind of civil society vigilance is liberal versus itself a kind of illiberal form, or is that not a risk at all? So those are just two very theoretical questions, but we have lots of other questions. So please raise your hand, and we'll go through, and please identify yourself. So we'll start in the back with Sherry.
Hi, Wolfgang. That was great, incredibly comprehensive and helpful. I'll just throw one thing out, which is not against what you were saying, but just a thought of consideration. So, you present, so here's the case for militant democracy, and here's the case against, and you're clearly somewhat more in the latter camp. Maybe another way of squaring that circle is say, look, there's justifications for militant democracy when democracies are young and weak and democratic institutions are not resilient, but as they gain in resilience, as they gain in legitimacy over time, the justifications for militant democracy become less. And I think of, when you plant a tree and, you have those sort of buttresses in the tree while it's, to make it resistant against weather and dogs peeing on it and all that kind of stuff. But then when it becomes strong, you take the buttresses away on the assumption that it is now capable of sort of dealing with whatever challenges to the tree, I think I've probably taken this analogy too far, exist. So maybe rather than saying, look, you have to be for or against, you could take it as a sort of stage-like kind of argument.
Great, thank you. Maybe one, yes, in the front.
I'm Rich Rosen, sort of an outside scholar. I think all these questions are excellent. Two more I have are the problem of ignorance, which is obviously central to democracy. I mean, in the extreme case, do I want people to vote whether climate change is real? I mean, in this country, we're almost at the point where the government may declare, well, climate change is not real, and how do you deal with that in a democracy? But ignorance generally is an issue, right? Especially given who we are. And the other issue I have is violence. So, there's kinds of violence like Germany had in the 20s with these armies roving around, Berlin and other parts of the country. But there's violence in terms of law, right? Laws can be very violent in their impact. Say here, abortion is an example, right? If you had a complete ban by law on abortion, you could say that's extreme violence against women and men too, indirectly. So that's a kind of violence. And so where do those kinds of considerations fit in? If you have a constitution that in a sense says there shouldn't be violence against people have all these rights, but then you have something like an abortion ban, what happens? How do you cope with that?
So maybe we'll get one more and then we'll do a second round. Let me just sneak in a question that's related to violence here. So you say that for Kelsen, who's the ultimate open, and he has this line where he says, written in 1932, where he says, if you really believe in democracy, you have to be willing to go down on a sinking ship and wait for another day, which, was lucky for him. He could flee to Berkeley, but, not for everybody else, right? So, but his red line is violence. So I was just wondering, do you know, is the red line use of violence, or is think of Donald Trump's incitement of violence, or, that there's an incitement of violence, rhetoric of violence, using violent language? I mean, what? I was just curious if you have an idea on what Kelsen thinks about that. Maybe one last question. So yes.
Yeah, Steve Sawyer. I'm here at the center this year. I guess the question, Ziblatt's questions are sort of focusing on the normative. I wanted to push back a little bit on your pragmatic. They strike me as relatively unimaginative as they're currently stated. I mean, could we really not start thinking a little bit more carefully about various ways that they could be? And this actually comes back to Daniel Ziblatt's question about how it is that parties are excluded all the times in all kinds of ways. I mean, to some extent, the entire lesson of the development of democracy in the last 20 years of the 19th century could be the creation of primaries, the creation of recall, or these are various ways that we were trying to think around some of what were perceived as the problems of a potential democratic degeneration. To some extent, a sort of Weberian theory of bureaucracy, right? I mean, is very much falls into this. So I guess, if you set it up that, either, it would just be very hard to do or very expensive or they just come back. I mean, yes, but it feels like we've been much more creative in trying to figure out ways of dealing with the challenges of democracy in the past. And I wonder if if your third way doesn't give more to that than if there aren't more pragmatic possibilities and more creative ways we could think about that.
Great. Okay. So giving you a lot to. Don't feel obligated, of course, to answer all. Just the ones that you think are interesting to respond to, or that you have answers for.
Thanks for the way to escape.
Yeah.
I start from in the row the questions were posed. Daniel, restricting pluralist choice, normative. The question of normative banning and effective institutional or social exclusion. Is this more or less on the same level? As a result, I would say yes. If you exclude the expression of opinions and interest by certain groups of the people, determined by class, determined by ethnicity, and so forth, it is not acceptable in a democracy where you have equal, so to say, equal rights. And not only, and this is what I would criticize with Hans Kelsen, not only on paper, but in reality. This was always the argument of Hermann Heller against Kelsen. We have to look that the rights which have to be secured in the Constitution and so forth, they have to be translated in reality. They have to be seen. And therefore, I would say there is not from the result and the damage for democracy, it's probably not a big difference. On the other hand, political parties are the most important actors within democratic system, in most of the democratic system. And without these intermediaries, it will not work, what we call representative democracy in large and highly complex democratic system. So you need it. And if you exclude a player from the set of pluralist actors, I think this has also symbolic character, and it will fall back on the political parties who launched and initiated and stimulated such a banning. So political parties have a very strong visibility, and the people will perceive this much more intensely than the secret exclusion by certain institutional rules.
Yeah, just one thing that makes me think of is, the 5% threshold in Germany is in effect a banning of parties that get less than 5%. And so one might say, what's the difference between banning a party that gets 20% and it's just a quantitative difference versus banning parties that get less than 5%? And I guess maybe one point about the difference between these is that the 5% rule is an impartial rule in the sense that it applies to everybody, whereas the targeted banning, sort of maybe has a sense of arbitrariness, or it's a targeted kind of exclusion as opposed to kind of general exclusion. So that may be.
Now, I would argue that proportional PR systems are much more democratic than majoritarian system, where sometimes even the loser of the popular vote can become the next governing coalition. So the 5%, I don't think it isn't theoretically spoken, it is an exclusion of innovative parties. On the other side, if you get as a political party more than 5% of the votes and you transcend this electoral threshold, then it gives a push to these parties. I'm not in favor of it. It is another contextual and historical explainable factor the founding fathers and the few mothers wrote into the Basic Law, because they argued the fragmentation of the political parties, not a strong argument, by the way. The fragmentation of the political party system in the Weimar Republic contributed to the collapse of democracy. But I would be against it, and these discussions we have from time to time, not during the last years, but in the 1970s, 80s, and so forth. Should we not reduce it, so to say, to Scandinavian levels, where you find it as well, quite often,
And Israeli levels.
2 or 4%. but it is a very good point that we have to look to institutional exclusion as well.
I didn't mean to sideline you from responding to the others. Yeah.
Uh, It's interesting, Sherry. Would it be, if I understand your question correctly, would it be legitimate for in weak and young democracies to ban political parties? So if I look, for example, to present Eastern Europe or during the last 3 decades, then Fidesz with Orban, if it would have been banned, would it would then Fidesz not have been able to damage the constitutional fabric and the political culture in this country? I think no. And I think such strong political parties you cannot ban. Who should have done it? The Constitutional Court. And therefore Orban felt it, and it is always one of the first steps to close down or to colonize constitutional courts. But I have to confess, I have to think about it, whether this would be then an argument. The empirical question would be who defines what is a weak democracy, who defines. And then the Constitutional Court comes again into the play, and I would have some problems to imagine how you can institutionalize such a thing. We have it to some extent in stronger democracy as well. The argument goes, if the party is minuscule, which is a very small party, why should we ban them? They are anyway not a danger to democracy. And this is indeed a question the German Constitutional Court has used in the second NPD trial, where they argued they are simply irrelevant. And if you look to France, where you wouldn't really discuss to ban the Rassemblement National, they try it now legitimately by courts. So to use the rule of law as a weapon against the Rassemblement National, they banned quite often smaller parties, very small parties. And this is what is something which I consider as superfluous. It doesn't make very much sense to ban these small parties. But if you have a strong party, then you ask immediately the question, can you ban 20% of the demos in such a way? And how to do it? And I was talking about the repression costs. What I did not mention, but I think it was in one of my transparency, militant democracy is not only about, in a constitutional sense, it's not only about banning political parties. There is Article 18 in the Basic Law where you can withdraw political rights from a single person. This is anyway also something Kelsen could not accept, and it was never applied, and at least was not successful. There is no withdrawal from any person, but we discuss it at the moment to the biggest neo-Nazi provocateur. We have Björn Höcke in Germany. And you can ban, which is easily done by the executive, political and social groups, which are not political parties. And political parties are explicitly, prominently named as political actors in the German constitution. Richard, the problem of ignorance, highly interesting. We end up with Schumpeter. Then Schumpeter, probably with his elitist concept of democracy, he was clear the people are victims of their passion and ignorance. And John Stuart Mill, I think, proposed that you have a pluralist system of voting, that the intellectuals have 4 votes and the working class has only 1 vote. And this is, you can read more of these articles and books in this time, that there should be a qualified voting, and ignorance is one of the enemies of democracy. Nevertheless, they may not vote on the whether there is a climate crisis, but how to fight it. They have the right in democracy to do it. And it's not only the most radical measures are the most legitimate in democratic terms, but you have to, the people have to decide what they do. If the people don't decide what to do, and if we complain there are too many veto players against the proper solution of such a tremendous problem, but then we are back with Plato, then you need a philosopher king, so to say, who is maybe the Green Party, who is able to recognize that this is a bigger problem than democracy. And you have these discussions at the margins of the Green movement. But I don't see any chance to go behind this equality argument of democracy. Creative ways, we are now on the 4th floor together, then we may have time to talk about it. Then we are probably back to democratic innovations, and the democratic innovation, participatory budgeting, and what else we know. I'm in favor of it, but it may strengthen the sense of common belongingness to a political community, because the citizens feel efficacy, and they feel that they might have a voice, but it will probably not solve the whole problem of the crisis of representation. But I think it is worthwhile to think about it, and now you have an emerging discussion also on militant constitutionalism. So you preserve your constitution, especially the constitutional court, then it cannot be dismantled by authoritarian populists. This is a discussion we have in Germany for the moment, to constitutionalize the simple laws which define the competencies and jurisdictions of the constitutional court.
Who is it that's making this argument about constitutionalizing?
Yeah, this is one. No, it's not only this Verfassungsblock. It is the political parties. They even want to push it through in this legislature before the election, and to find a broad consensus among the democratic parties.
Yeah, in terms of, we talk about the ignorance of voters, but of course, I noticed all the words may and probably. You know, you ask political scientists what the effects of any of this stuff are, and there's so much uncertainty attached with any of these reforms that we are not so different than the average voter. Let me, just 2 last questions, it looks like, before we wrap up here, so we can go, okay, I'll try to get.
So I'm going to pass, because actually the question I was about to ask was answered in the last statement, so
Okay.
I'll pass.
Right, yeah.
Thank you very much for this very stimulating talk, and which is a very.
Can you raise your voice,
Oh,
please?
I'm sorry. Thank you very much for the very interesting and stimulating conversation. Maybe just one question on your third way strategy of putting more focus on the output perspective of democracy. I think nobody would basically disagree that it's important, to deliver on the policies, but as I understand it, so many policy debates that we have in Europe these days particularly revolve about the question that oftentimes these kind of delivering on these outputs is no longer feasible. For example, because these right-wing populist parties have already developed that blackmailing potential that you've been mentioning, even if they fall short of a Sperrminorität, they still have this kind of implicit blackmailing potential. And I think the second barrier to these kind of putting more emphasis on the output as a way of defending democracy is maybe also the context on the current informational environment that we have. So even if the economy is going well, how can people actually start realizing, or ignorant people start realizing this, if they're no longer exposed to certain informational environments, that they can be convinced of these kind of outputs that democracy delivers. So maybe my question is how practically and politically, how this kind of emphasis on more output and a more output-oriented democracy can really be done so that it's effective enough to actually help safeguarding democracy.
So there's more questions, but I think we have to, unfortunately, apologize to those who have raised their hands. So another way to put this question is Joe Biden sure thought that's what he was doing over the last 4 years, and it didn't work out so well for him. So yeah, what do you have any final thoughts on this? Yeah. Go ahead, Daniel.
I mentioned this argument that output matters, and even in the times of crisis, it matters more than in normal, non-turbulent times. And in these times, we are thinking more about democratizing democracy. And this was a debate, especially after 1989, talking about these democratic innovation, enlarging and broadening democratic participation. Nevertheless, we know something about the link between economic crisis and the inclination of the voters to look to more radical solutions, to more radical political actors. And in the moment where we know it, we can discover that the increasing inequality, so to say, the prevention of creating equivalent life chances, as it has Amartya Sen once called it, then you follow a democratic imperative of inclusion, of social inclusion. And the people feel represented to some extent. If you are, so to say, not that successful as Biden was with reducing inflation and the steep increase of prices on the one hand, and a much lower increase of salaries and incomes on the other hand, then it might be even an argument. You have to strengthen it, and you have to be successful, and not only to announce it, so to say. Rachel, I'm not completely sure if I understood the core of the question and of your question. If the more emphasis on output can only come in the electoral competition. And if political parties are losing elections, this is a moment where they can reflect, and sometimes they do reflect, why did we lose the elections? And it is not so far-fetched to look to the economy. We learned it since Bill Clinton. It is the economy where people are looking at. And it doesn't mean that political actors are always so rational in electoral terms that they do it. But nevertheless, if there would be a more social embedding of citizen with equal life chances, it would be much easier for democracy to flourish. And I'm sure you would not have these extremist political parties, at least not to that degree we are witnessing them in Europe now.
Right, well, thank you, and again, apologies to those who I wasn't able to call on, but thank you very much, Wolfgang. Please join me in thank you, Wolfgang.
Last point,
Yes,
I forgot
yes,
it.
yeah,
Last
please. Yeah,
point on civil society. I think we sometimes, even I brought it forward, but civil society is not only the nice, beautiful, and wonderful solution for all the problems. And we have dark sides of civil society. Pegida, and in former times, fascist movements, parts of dark side of political, of civil society. And even your biggest civic association, probably in the United States, the NRA, it's not, so to say, the source of democratic sensibility and liberalism. So there are dark sides, and we should, I think, without state, you don't find a solution.
Thank you very much.